The sun was just beginning to set over the small town of Maplewood, casting long shadows over its narrow streets and aging storefronts. For years, this quiet place had been simmering with unspoken tensions, an invisible line dividing its diverse residents. That line was about to be tested. When the news broke that former President Donald Trump would be visiting, the reactions were immediate and polarized. Some residents were excited, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who once occupied the highest office in the land. Others were skeptical, even angry, seeing his visit as a political stunt that would only reignite old wounds. In the heart of Maplewood stood Marcus Hayes, the town's unofficial leader of hope. Marcus was a middle-aged African-American man with a commanding presence, someone who had spent decades working to heal the fractures in his community. To him, Trump's arrival was a bitter pill. What does he think he's going to accomplish here? Marcus muttered to his assistant, pacing the modest office of his community center. This town doesn't need more speeches, we need action. Meanwhile, Donald Trump sat in a sleek black SUV rolling into town. Though outwardly confident, he felt a pang of unease. It's not like the old rallies, he admitted to one of his aides, glancing at the protest signs already visible along the road. This is different. These people, they're not here to cheer. For a man used to commanding crowds, the thought of facing open hostility was unnerving, though he'd never let it show. The first encounter between Trump and Marcus happened that evening in the town's small community hall. Trump extended a hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hayes, I've heard a lot about the work you're doing here," he said. Marcus hesitated for a moment, studying Trump's face. "Work that's been ignored by people in power for far too long," Marcus replied, shaking the offered hand but keeping his tone measured. The air between them was thick with tension, each man sizing up the other. The dialogue that followed was pointed and raw. Marcus didn't hold back, recounting stories of families struggling to survive, of children trapped in cycles of poverty and discrimination. "You talk about making America great again," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "But what does that mean for people like us? What does that mean for a town like Maplewood?" Trump listened, his expression hard to read. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table between them. "I understand your frustration," he said, his voice steady but tinged with defensiveness. "But you have to believe me when I say I want to see every community in this country succeed." Marcus scoffed but stopped short of interrupting. "Then prove it," he said simply, folding his arms. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their voices a mix of chants and conversations. Some held signs reading "Unity Now," while others displayed slogans critical of Trump. Inside the hall, the conversation between Trump and Marcus was just beginning, but already, the town could feel the ripples of what was to come. Both men, though worlds apart, carried the weight of expectations, Marcus, as the voice of a silenced community, and Trump, as the figure who had both inspired and divided a nation. The evening ahead would determine whether this meeting would deepen the town's divisions or begin to bridge them in ways no one had expected. As the community hall filled to capacity, the tension in the air was almost palpable. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers, supporters, and skeptics, fell silent as Marcus and Trump took their places on a small stage. This wasn't a rally. It wasn't a political event. It was an impromptu meeting of two opposing forces, one representing the voices of the disenfranchised, and the other embodying power and privilege. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice steady and deliberate. "Mr. Trump, I invited you here tonight because my community deserves answers. We've endured years of neglect, of policies that claim to lift us up but leave us behind. If you're here to listen, then I hope you're ready to hear the truth." Trump adjusted his tie, his face composed but his eyes sharp. "I'm here because I believe in every American's potential, Marcus. And I'm here because I don't back away from a challenge. You think I haven't made mistakes? Fine, but don't pretend I haven't fought for this country. The room murmured at Trump's response, but Marcus was unyielding. Fought for who? He asked, his tone cutting. The small businesses in this town that closed because they couldn't compete? The kids in my community center who don't see a future because their schools are underfunded? Tell me, Mr. Trump, where were you for them? Trump leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. Don't lecture me about fighting for people, Marcus. I've created jobs, millions of them. And if your town is struggling, maybe it's time to look at your own leadership too. Don't put all the blame on me. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, but Marcus didn't flinch. Leadership starts at the top, he shot back. And the top failed us. You talk about jobs, but a paycheck doesn't solve systemic racism. It doesn't erase generations of inequality. Trump stood up, his towering figure casting a shadow over the table. Systemic racism? I'm tired of people like you saying I don't care about communities like this. Do you think I wanted this town to fail? That I wanted anyone in this country to fail? Marcus stood as well, the room now completely silent as the two men faced off. I don't care what you wanted, Mr. Trump. I care about what you did. Words are cheap. Actions are what matter. The tension reached a breaking point as a voice from the crowd yelled, "He's right." Another shouted, "Give him a chance." The crowd began to split into factions, their voices growing louder, echoing the division on stage. Trump raised a hand, his voice booming. Enough. This isn't about taking sides. It's about fixing what's broken. He turned to Marcus. You want action? Then work with me. Show me what needs to be done, and I'll back you. But stop acting like I'm the enemy here. Marcus hesitated, his emotions conflicting with his sense of duty. He looked out at the crowd, then back at Trump. You want to help? Prove it, he said, his voice low but firm. Come with me tomorrow. Walk through my community. Talk to the people. See their lives. Then maybe, just maybe, we'll believe you. Trump nodded, the challenge accepted. Fine. I'll be there. But you'd better be ready to show me the truth. I promised you that I would help rebuild this town, Trump began, his words carrying a seriousness that was hard to ignore. And we've made great strides together. But this isn't just about me. It's about the people of Maplewood. The hardworking men and women who never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against them. Together, we are making this town great again. But I won't stop here. The next step is bringing in the resources to make sure the next generation doesn't face the same struggles. The crowd remained silent, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Marcus watched closely. He had been a part of every meeting, every negotiation, and every conversation. Yet, even now, he wasn't sure whether he fully trusted Trump. Action spoke louder than words, and while some progress had been made, it still felt like there was so much more to do. Suddenly, a voice from the back of the room interrupted Trump's speech. You say all this, but where's the action? Where's the real change? It was Sarah, a young woman who had grown up in Maplewood and worked tirelessly in the community center to provide after-school programs for children. Her voice rang out, challenging the very promises Trump had been touting. She was met with murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Trump's face hardened for a moment, his posture stiffening. I'm here, aren't I? He shot back, his voice thick with frustration. I've done more for this town than anyone else. You want results, I'm giving you results. But Sarah wasn't backing down. Results aren't just about money, Mr. Trump. They're about trust. You can't come in here and throw money at problems and expect everything to change. The people here need more than just your promises. We need change from the ground up. The room fell into a tense silence. Marcus, watching from the back, felt a familiar pressure in his chest. He could sense the mounting anger in the room. People were tired of waiting for change to be handed to them, they wanted to see it in their everyday lives. This was the moment of reckoning, where Trump's words would either match his actions, or the fragile unity built over the past months would crumble. He stood up and slowly walked toward the stage, his face calm but resolute. As he approached the microphone, the room went still. Marcus turned to the crowd, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over everyone. I've worked with people from every background, every walk of life, Marcus said, looking directly at Trump. I've seen what happens when promises aren't kept. But I've also seen what happens when people come together and fight for each other. Maplewood doesn't need another speech. It doesn't need another promise. It needs a plan. It needs action. So, Mr. Trump, I'm asking you, show us that you're committed to this. Not just today, but tomorrow. Not just for a photo op, but for the long haul. For a long moment, there was no response. Trump stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The room was on the edge of anticipation, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone present. This was no longer about politics, it was about the future of a town that had been overlooked for far too long. Finally, Trump stepped forward, his voice quieter now, though still strong. You want action, Marcus? He asked, his gaze meeting Marcus's. I'll give you action. But you need to meet me halfway. We're in this together. No more waiting. The crowd exhaled as the tension seemed to lift, but it was clear that the road ahead would be long. There was still work to be done, and there were still many hurdles to overcome. But in that moment, something had changed. The walls that had once divided the town seemed just a little bit lower. The crowd began to applaud, cautiously at first, but the applause grew stronger, until the hall was filled with the sound of people united, not just in hope, but in action. It was a moment of truth, a moment where the past met the future, where words became something more than empty promises. And in that brief moment, Maplewood had found its path forward. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, there was a sense that real change might just be possible. The weeks that followed were filled with a whirlwind of activity, meetings, debates, and negotiations as the promised plans began to take shape. Maplewood was being transformed, but the progress was slow. With every new project, there were setbacks. Old systems resisted change, and old wounds in the community were slow to heal. It was clear that what had started as an agreement between Marcus and Trump was now a high-stakes game, and it was becoming harder to tell who was truly leading the charge. The town was set to gather again, but this time it wasn't just to celebrate progress, it was to address the overwhelming doubts that had begun to take root. After a few missteps, people were questioning whether Trump's promises would hold up. Would the changes last? Would he truly follow through on his commitments? For some, the once hopeful anticipation had turned into apprehension. For others, they still clung to the hope that things would get better. But no one was sure. As the evening of the grand town meeting arrived, the room was full of unease. Marcus stood at the front, flanked by local leaders, and waited for Trump. The clock ticked away as the crowd grew restless. No one had expected Trump to be late, not after all the speeches, all the promises, and all the media coverage that had followed his visits. Yet, there he was, nowhere to be seen. Whispers spread through the crowd, growing louder with each passing minute. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the door opened. Trump walked in, flanked by his security detail, his usual air of confidence replaced with a visible weariness. As he approached the stage, Marcus, who had been watching him closely, could sense something had changed in Trump. Gone was the brash, combative man who had stormed through the town in the beginning. Instead, the man who stood before them now seemed different, more vulnerable, as though he had been forced to reckon with the reality of what had been promised. Trump walked up to the podium and cleared his throat. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his words, for any sign that he was still committed to the changes he had promised. But what came next caught everyone off guard. "I've seen a lot in my time, things I'm proud of, and things I wish I could undo," Trump began, his voice softer than usual, his gaze fixed on the audience. "But there's something I've learned through all of this. I came here thinking I could just fix everything with a few grand gestures, but that's not how it works. The truth is, real change isn't easy. It's painful. It takes time. And I've made mistakes along the way." A murmur rippled through the crowd as they processed his words. Was this the same man who had promised to deliver on every corner of Maplewood? Was this some sort of political maneuver or a genuine admission of fault? Marcus stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He had waited for this moment, for Trump to face the truth of what the people of Maplewood had been through. It wasn't about speeches or photo ops anymore. It was about honesty and responsibility. Trump continued, his voice growing more firm. "I made promises, and I intend to keep them. But I can't do it alone. I need the people of this town, people like Marcus, people like Sarah, people who have been here long before I arrived, to help lead the way. This isn't about me. It's about us, about coming together to build something better." There was a pause as his words sank in. For the first time, Trump wasn't trying to take all the credit. He wasn't standing on his own, waving his accomplishments. Instead, he was sharing the burden of responsibility with the community. It was a rare moment of humility from a man who had often been criticized for his lack of it. Marcus stepped forward, his face a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "This is what we've been waiting for," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment was not lost on him. "We don't need promises anymore. We need action. We need everyone working together, community leaders, government officials, everyday people. This is where it all starts, and it starts now." Trump nodded. "I agree. Let's build something lasting. Something that will stand the test of time." For the first time, it felt like the beginning of something real. Trump's words weren't just hollow promises, they were the foundation of what could be a true partnership between the people of Maplewood and the resources that Trump had the power to bring. It was clear that this moment would be pivotal. It was the culmination of months of struggle, of conflict, and of uneasy compromise. But it was also the birth of a new understanding, a shared commitment to build a future together. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. There was still work to be done, there were still countless challenges ahead, but the energy in the room had shifted. The divisions had started to heal, the wounds of the past had begun to close, and there was hope, genuine hope, that, for the first time in years, Maplewood might just get the future it deserved. The meeting ended with a sense of unity, not because the town had found all the answers, but because it had taken the first real step toward them. The crowd filed out, their spirits lifted, knowing that the journey ahead would be long, but no longer impossible. And as Marcus stood at the back of the hall, watching people leave with a renewed sense of purpose, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Maplewood, but for the country as a whole. A chapter where differences were set aside, where people came together not because they agreed on everything, but because they recognized that, sometimes, the best way to move forward is together. Months passed, and the town of Maplewood slowly began to feel the ripple effects of the changes that had been set in motion. The streets were cleaner, the schools had better resources, and more families were finding steady work through the programs initiated by the federal grants. While the transformation wasn't immediate, the seeds of change had been planted, and the community, once divided, was starting to pull together in ways it hadn't in decades. Marcus Hayes continued to lead with quiet determination, now working alongside local leaders and even former adversaries who had once viewed him as an outsider. The community center he had fought so hard to build was thriving, offering educational programs, job training, and support for families. Every day, he saw firsthand how much the people of Maplewood cared for each other, how they were willing to fight for a better future, even when the odds were stacked against them. Trump, though still a controversial figure, had come to understand that his role was not to dictate the future of the town, but to empower the people who lived there. He continued to support the town financially, but his involvement shifted. Instead of swooping in with top-down solutions, he worked more closely with Marcus and other local leaders, listening to their ideas and helping to remove barriers to progress. He had made a pact with the town, a pact that was about more than politics. It was about trust, about showing up when it mattered, and about taking responsibility. One crisp afternoon, Trump returned to Maplewood, not for a speech, but for a more personal visit. The town hall meeting, once a place of tension and division, had become a space for open dialogue and community building. The room was filled with familiar faces, some who had embraced the changes, others who were still skeptical, but all were committed to working together. Marcus stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been ours," he said, his voice strong yet humble. "We've worked hard, we've fought for what we deserve, and we've learned that change doesn't come overnight. But we've proven something today. We've proven that when we come together, no matter where we come from or who we are, we can make a difference. And that's what this town is built on, people who care, people who fight for what's right." Trump stood beside him, a stark contrast to the brash man who had once marched into town with grand promises. He looked out over the crowd, the weight of the moment clear in his eyes. "I may not have known everything about this place when I first arrived," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But I've learned a lot. And I've seen the power of the people here. You all have the strength to build a future that's better than the one you were handed. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. And I'm committed to seeing it through, as long as it takes." The crowd was quiet for a moment, as if processing the gravity of the moment. Then, one by one, they began to clap. The applause grew in intensity, not out of blind adoration, but out of recognition that, for the first time, they had seen real change. Change that was hard-earned and still unfolding, but real nonetheless. Marcus turned to Trump with a small nod. "This is just the beginning," he said. Trump nodded back, his gaze lingering on the crowd. "We'll keep working on it. Together." As the meeting concluded, the townspeople lingered, talking among themselves about what had been accomplished and what was still left to do. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope in the air, not the kind of fleeting hope that comes with promises, but the kind that grows through hard work and collective effort. That evening, as the sun set over Maplewood, the streets seemed a little brighter. People walked home in groups, talking and laughing, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they were part of something bigger than themselves. There was still much to be done, but they were no longer afraid to take the next step. Marcus stood at the edge of the town, looking out over the horizon. He had seen a lot in his life, pain, struggle, and heartbreak. But he had also seen resilience, determination, and, most importantly, change. This was no fairy tale ending. There would be challenges ahead, and the road wouldn't always be smooth. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he could finally see the future clearly, a future that was worth fighting for. And as the stars began to twinkle above Maplewood, he couldn't help but believe that, just maybe, the town had finally found its way. Not because of one man's promise, but because of the collective strength of a community that refused to give up. They had learned that true change comes when people come together, work together, and never stop believing in each other. In the end, it wasn't just about what had been accomplished, it was about what was still possible. The story of Maplewood wasn't over. It was just beginning.